so we are in Unit 5, starting congruent criteria. The first thing we have to remember is some review things. So I'll zoom in here. It is sideways. That's okay. We need to review the reflexive property, which is where AB is equal to BA. When the triangles have an angle or a side in common, you know that it's equal to itself. Number 2, vertical angles are congruent. When two lines are intersecting, these angles across from each other are congruent. 3, right angles are congruent. All right angles are 90 degrees, therefore they are congruent. 4, alternate interior angles of parallel lines are congruent. So you need to make sure if we see these notations for parallel lines that we remember the alternate interior angles are congruent. 5, definition of a segment bisector. When you have a segment bisector, as Q is, you know that the two halves are congruent. So TQ is going to be congruent to RQ. Number 6, definition of a midpoint. A midpoint results in two segments being congruent. So if this point J is the midpoint, then we know that this side is congruent to that side. Number 7, definition of an angle bisector. This results in two congruent angles. So if we have this angle bisector right here, we now know that this angle is congruent to that angle. Number 8, definition of perpendicular bisector. So it results in two congruent segments and right angles. So we know that it is a bisector of the segment and it is perpendicular, therefore both of the angles it creates are 90 degrees. And this last one wasn't a theorem that we exactly went over, but it is good to know the third angle theorem. If two angles of a triangle are congruent to two angles of another triangle, then by deductive reasoning we can say that the third angles in both triangles are congruent. One thing that is important to note for this entire unit is to not assume anything if it's not given. Okay? You can deduce using these things that we just reviewed, but you cannot assume anything unless it's given. Okay? Throughout this unit, we're going to be going through the 5 different ways to prove triangles are congruent. These are those right there. Today, we are simply going to be doing side, 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 angle, side, and angle, side, angle. Okay. So this first one is side, side, side. What this means is simply that all 3 pairs of corresponding sides are congruent. So if you have 2 triangles, and this side is congruent to that side because they are corresponding. This is congruent to that. And this last one is congruent to the other corresponding side. And if you know that all 3 sides are congruent, then you know that these are congruent triangles. Number 2 is side, angle, side, where 2 pairs of corresponding sides and the angle between them emphasis on between the sides are congruent. Okay, so if you're given a pair of triangles, just like before, and you know that 2 pairs of corresponding sides, so here's a pair, and here's a pair, and the angle between them are all congruent, then you know that these 2 triangles have to be congruent to each other. Okay? And then the last one is angle, side, angle. That's when 2 pairs of corresponding angles and the side between them, again, emphasis on between, are congruent. So these are the first three ways to prove that two triangles are congruent. So for this last one, if I'm given two triangles, sorry, my drawings are rather rudimentary, and you have two pairs of corresponding angles, so here's one pair, and here's two pairs. And the side between them, notice that this side is between those angles. If you have those three things that are congruent to each other, then you know that those two triangles must be congruent to each other. Okay? So those are the first three postulates that we're going to be using to prove that triangles are congruent. And now in this next part, we're going to be stating the congruent parts, the congruent statement like we did yesterday, and if they're congruent by side, 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 angle, side, or angle, side, angle. So number one, let's change to the color. Congruent parts are shown in the figure. Okay, so we're not assuming anything. They're shown for us. So part A says AC is congruent to which side? Well, if you look over here, there's one hash mark, so AC is congruent to segment FD. Part B, AB is going to be congruent to FE. Now, we'll be doing this one together, and then you can pause the video and try number 2 on your own. Part C, blank is congruent to DE. Well, this is the last side that we are given, so DE is going to be congruent to CB, segment CB. Okay, so those are the three different things that this figure showed us. And now we're going to create a congruent statement. So just like we learned yesterday, you need to make sure that we line up the letters with their corresponding vertices. Sorry, the vertex A corresponds with vertex F, B corresponds with E, and C corresponds with B. So triangle ABC is congruent to triangle FED. And how do we know this? Well, we're given a side, and another side. So our postulate that we're using is SSS, or side, 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 that first one we went over. So right now, why don't you go ahead and pause the video, and you can work out number 2 on your own. Okay, so hopefully you did this on your own. Now, let's go through it together. Congruent parts that are shown in the figure. Over here we were given fill in the blanks. Now we're coming up with it on our own. So all I'm looking at are these notations, these markings over here, and I'm going to figure out what they mean. So right here I see that VY, segment VY, is going to be congruent to segment WY, because they both have that one tick mark, right? They have the same notation. For B, I'm going to look at another side. I can see that UY is congruent to XY, segment XY. And then lastly, this last notation for my angles, I cannot just call this angle Y though, because that's not specific enough. So like we learned in the previous unit, we're going to use 3 letters, and it'll be angle UYV is congruent, which is this one right here, UYV, is congruent to angle XYW. Those are the 3 different things shown in this figure. Next, we need to create our congruent statement. So triangle YWX is going to be congruent to Y is corresponding, and then V corresponds with W, and then U corresponds with X. So triangle YWX is congruent to triangle YVU. And lastly, how do we know that? Using one of those 3 postulates. Well, as you can see, it's side, angle in between, and then side. So our postulate is SAS. Alright, next we're moving on to part 2. State if the 2 triangles are congruent by side, 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 angle, or not congruent. Okay. So number 3, I see these notations, so I have a side, and then if you look right here, because of what we reviewed before, we know that by the reflexive property, this side is congruent to itself. Change the color again. And therefore we know by the side postulate that these two triangles are congruent. Okay, next we're looking over here. And number 4, why don't you go ahead and pause the video though right now and try and attempt 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 on your own. See if you can figure out which postulate or if they are just not congruent right now. Okay, coming back to number 4. Right here we see this side and that side. This side and this side are congruent. And then we've got this angle. But for number 4, you can see that this goes side, angle, side. But is this the same location of angle on this side? Is the angle in between the sides? No, it's not. Therefore, it doesn't qualify for one of our postulates, and it is not congruent. Number 5, we've got an angle and another angle, and then we know using the reflexive property that this is congruent to itself. So we have the side angle, side, angle postulate that proves these triangles congruent. Number 6, we've got an angle and a side. It's not quite enough information, but as you can see in the middle here, we've got some vertical angles. Because we reviewed that, we know that vertical angles are congruent. And now as you can see, angle, side, angle, these are in fact congruent triangles. Number 7, we've got a side and an angle. Again, we're using that reflexive property. This side is congruent to itself. And as you can see, it is now side, angle, side. If you need to pause the video at any point to explain this or for questions or to try this on your own, please do so. And then the last one, number 8, we can see this reflexive property again. And then if you look at this, I've got a side, and an angle. But this angle, in order to be congruent, has to be inside, in between the two pairs of congruent sides, and it's not, therefore it is not congruent. Okay, part 3, we're going to draw the symbols on the picture that complete the congruent statement and give the congruence postulate we used. Okay? So, right now it says that angle TVU is congruent to angle WUV. So first I want to draw the symbols. TVU, this angle, is congruent to WUV, which is right here. And segment UW is congruent to segment VT. Okay, so I've labeled what they've given us. Alright. Now the other part is this middle line right here. Again, we are using the reflexive property, so I know it's congruent to itself. Now we can write the congruent statement. Triangle TUV is going to be congruent to triangle WVU because we've got to figure out the corresponding sides. T corresponds with W. U actually corresponds with V on the other triangle. As you can see, U does not have any notation, same with V on this triangle. Then V, this angle, corresponds with U. So you've got to be careful on that. And we know by the postulate of side, angle, side. Okay, so why don't you go ahead, pause the video, see if you can figure out the next questions, and then we will restart on the following video.